And go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks. So welcome everyone to the first invited talk of Crypto 2021. So we're happy and honored to have Vanessa Teague as our invited speaker. Vanessa is the CEO of Thinking Cybersecurity and an associate professor at the Australian National University. She received her PhD from Stanford University in 2005, and her thesis was one of the very first works that combined cryptography and game theory. Since then, Vanessa has been based in Australia, and she did a lot of great work, has been doing a lot of great work. In particular, she is very extremely active working on technical cryptographic problems that are of public interest. So one example is protection of government data. She was part of a team that re-identified doctors and patients in an open data set published by the Australian government, which concerned over 2.5 million people, and she was advocating for notifying the affected people, which resulted in a big backlash from the Australian government, who put pressure on her department. She was at the University of Melbourne at the time, and she resigned over this. Another example is the topic of her talk today, which is e-voting and election integrity, where she's also done a lot of work, and which was recognized by a Research Excellence Award from the Election Verification Network. She both discovered vulnerabilities in several deployed systems, as well as suggested better protocols. And I'm looking forward to hear more in her talk. So I just want to say on a personal note that I really admire Vanessa for being an outspoken advocate for cryptography and for society and for doing the right thing. So thank you.
Hey, thank you, Tal. And thanks for having me, everybody. It's such a pleasure to join crypto virtually when nobody can be there in person. Questions are really, really welcome. I'm going to not take up the whole hour. I'm going to kind of hope to leave some time for discussion for everybody at the end. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Which e-voting problems do we need to solve? The question is deliberately a little bit ambiguous because it's not clear whether the emphasis is meant to be on we or solve, and the answer is both. So I'm hoping that this talk can help other cryptographers who are interested in democracy in their own country to have a go at making it better. Everything I'm about to talk about is joint work. If I listed all the people with whom it is joint work, I'd be bound to leave somebody out. But I always feel bad giving these kind of invited talks as if it's all about me, when in fact, everything I'm going to say is joint work with at least some other really, really good people. And one of the funnest things about working in this field, of course, is the rest of the community. Okay, so here we go. So, democracy. It's certainly in crisis. Is it really stuffed? Well, I guess I wouldn't be giving this talk if I thought the answer was yes, but certainly democracy is not looking that good at the moment. This is an article from the South China Morning Post, which is kind of tragic in itself. It's from 2018. It ticked me off at the time because of this idea, this dichotomy between prosperous authoritarianism and chaotic freedom, which apparently is a reference to some quote by Xi Jinping about how chaotic democracy is. And the main thing about this picture is, of course, now that we can look back on it 3 years later, only one of these chaps is still in charge of his country. And to me, this is kind of the superpower of democracy, right? No matter how bad, I don't think anyone would claim that it always chooses the best person, but the thing that it does is give us the opportunity to get rid of somebody that we really realize we made a mistake about. However, I think this picture indicates to us that the threat model for secure electoral processes is about as hard as it can possibly be, right? The adversary is the most powerful person in the country, who may be the most powerful person in the world, and they have a degree of control of the infrastructure and the process, and you have to assume that they're willing to do just about everything to stay in power. If we can't secure the process of running a democratic election, then we really lose, I guess it's pretty obvious, we lose the power of democracy altogether. And when the core property of a democracy is the capacity to kind of self-correct and revert back to a different state, if we don't like the state we're in, then I guess it's obvious that the security of the electoral process is absolutely critical. So I don't think democracy is really stuffed. I think it is in crisis, but I think it is in crisis in a sense that we can still use that crisis to do something about improving its security. In some ways, the security of e-voting is better motivated now than it has been in the popular mind for a long time. So what can cryptographers do about all this? Well, this talk is addressed to other cryptographers who'd like to help support their own democracies. And I'm going to kind of run with the working assumption that most human beings in most countries are basically rational, even though you might say that the empirical evidence in support of this thesis is a bit iffy at present. I still think it's really mostly true. I'm not, sadly, going to say very much about people who are already living under authoritarian regimes. I think it's horrific, but there isn't, I can't think of very much to do about that. I'm kind of assuming that this is helpful for residents of countries that are already meant to be democratic and already have some kind of democratic political process that you can imagine helping to support. Okay, I've arranged the things that we can do through the talk around 3 approximate themes with icons as follows. First of all, things we can do. We can find bugs and gaps in existing schemes and tell people what the vulnerabilities in a thing they're already using are. We can design nifty new schemes with clever and interesting mathematical properties. Or finally, we can teach people to think adversarially. And I actually suspect that if you haven't tried talking to your local authorities or parliamentarians about security, you probably don't realize how this adversarial mindset and thinking about an attacker is unusual. And, it's a thing that we do in this community, but is not a thing that most people think of. Most people just kind of want stuff to work. So the first 2 things in my little bullet list are fun, right? It's fun to attack things and think about the technical details of things. It's fun to design new schemes. I assume if you're listening to an invited talk at Crypto, then you probably find the first 2 things fun. The last thing is really hard, actually, really, really hard, and often not very much fun. But I actually suggest that in some ways, that is the most useful thing that some of us can do for democratic processes, is just persuade people that there is the potential for attack and help them think through actually defending against surreptitious attack, rather than the thing that almost everybody else on planet Earth does naturally, which is try and make sure that everything looks okay. Okay, so what are the security requirements of elections? Well, they really haven't changed for 2,500 years. So the security requirements of elections are public verifiability and the secret ballot. Secret ballot is important to stop people being coerced to vote in a certain way, and public verifiability is important to stop cheating and to stop people believing that there's been cheating. So the picture on the right is jury voting discs from the Athenian Agora from 400 something BC. And you can see that they're designed so that the difference between a guilty vote and a not guilty vote is very subtle. It's a matter of whether the little disc is perforated through the center. And so they're designed so that a voter, in this case a juror, can walk out in a public place with the vote they intend to cast in their hand, and they can chuck it into the right urn. And everybody can see that everybody's tossed exactly one voting disc in, but nobody can see how any individual voted. So this process, which is one of the earliest voting processes we know, was clearly carefully designed with the technology that they had in mind to achieve these 2 crucial security properties that are still the crucial security properties that we seek now. If you're in France or nearby countries, you might have seen this, you might have this glass voting urn kind of concept, which again is the same sort of thing. You put your vote in a little envelope, and then you put the envelope in a big glass urn, and everybody can see that everybody's put exactly one envelope in the urn, and then everybody can hang around and watch the count afterwards. So how do we do this with computers? Well, the answer is it's hard because, of course, computers are sort of inherently unscrutinizable. So first question, are there bugs or security problems in existing voting schemes? What do you reckon? I'm not going to talk in detail about all of these schemes, but the short answer is yes, there are. I'm going to talk a little bit about the errors that we found in the Swiss Post CITL system and what the implications for iVote in New South Wales are. There is some very good security analysis of a system called Votes that has been spruiked in the United States. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Civitas JCJ system. And I'm going to talk briefly about the Estonian system before we go on too far. Okay. But my point is, this list is just about everything, right? This is just about everything, and everything that we've actually tried in practice over the internet has been broken in some really substantial way. All right, the first thing that I'm going to talk about, and this is primarily not a technical talk. Most of the technical details are in, I assume that if you care about the technical details, you've probably seen it already. But I want to talk just briefly about the story surrounding the Swiss Post CITL New South Wales iVote internet voting system. So for those who don't know, this is a story from a year or two ago. The Swiss cantons have the option of voting over the internet in a way that is regulated through the Federal Chancellery, but actually provided by Swiss Post. Swiss Post outsourced the production of the software to a private company called CITL, and the Federal Chancellery imposed a bunch of rules about privacy, individual and public verifiability, and transparency of the source code in the system. We found two and a half substantial bugs in the verification mechanisms that were supposed to be part of the system and which were required to be part of the system by law for the certification standard that it was applying for. So there were two different ways in which a cheating prover could pass verification but manipulate the votes. And in this case, the prover was the authority running the election. So the component doing the mixing or the decrypting of the electronic votes. So the system used an implementation of the Bayer-Groth mixnet, and they also used standard things that you will know about. The Fiat-Schmee heuristic applied to Sean Peterson proofs. They used Peterson commitments for the Bayer-Groth mixnet. There's nothing wrong with any of these components. But the problem arose because of the way in which the specific details fitted together. In the case of the Bayer-Groth mixnet, it was implemented with Peterson commitments without making sure that the trapdoor wasn't known. So Peterson commitments are a trapdoor commitment system. If you know the discrete log of one of the commitment parameters with respect to the other commitment parameter, then you can immediately see that you can commit to something and then open it any way you like. In this system, the designers failed to specify that you had to verify that the parameters had been properly constructed. And in fact, it's even a little bit worse than that. They actually constructed it in such a way that the mixers who were proving the shuffle did actually know the trapdoor, even in just the ordinary, honest run of the protocol. So this is joint work with Sarah Jamie Lewis and Olivier Pereira, and it was independently noticed by Thomas Haynes and Ralph Haney. And it's easy to see that if you are the prover in a Bayer and Groth's mixnet, and if you are able to if you know the trapdoor for the commitments you've been using to commit to the permutation matrix, then you can easily see that you can kind of commit to one matrix, prove that it's a permutation, but then when you actually come to mix, you can mix with something else. So this allowed a cheating mixnet that was supposed to be shuffling the votes to substitute votes but provide a proof transcript that passed verification and in fact was indistinguishable from an honest one. So that was not good. And then in a separate thing, another important detail was that when they were implementing their decryption proofs, they used a weak version of the Fiat-Shamir heuristic in which they didn't hash all of the statement. And that would have been fine against a prover who was not adaptive, that is a prover who couldn't choose the statement. But it turned out in this system that they needed an adaptively secure primitive because in fact provers could partly choose the statement that they were proving, and in this case the weak Fiat-Shamir heuristic was not sufficient. So this bug allowed a authority that was doing decryption to fake a proof that the ciphertext actually decrypted to something else. And they didn't have much freedom over what they could choose, so they really could only turn a valid vote into a vote that looked like nonsense, but they could still pass verification without honestly decrypting. Okay, so the technical details, I assume if you care about the technical details, you've probably already read it, but the bottom line is there was nothing wrong with any of the components as such, in the sense that there's nothing wrong with Peterson commitments or the Bayeux-Groth mixnet, or even with the weak Fiat-Shamir heuristic. There's a problem with the context in which they were used, requiring different security properties from the way that they were implemented. This is going to be a bit of a theme. So the interesting thing about this set of bugs was that because they existed in one vendor's solution, they affected two different software systems on opposite sides of the world. We found out about them in the context of the Swiss system because the Swiss had implemented a transparency program and in fact had transparency regulations. But we found out afterwards, or almost immediately afterwards, that the same buggy mixnet and decryption system was already in use in the Australian state of New South Wales. So part of the interesting thing for this talk is to look at how those two different places dealt with this almost identical problem. Okay, so we had two different places, both realised that they had run or were running or were planning to run in the very near future broken systems in real elections. Here's what happened in Switzerland. This is the Swiss federal chancellor, and you can see he's been making some quite strong public statements about how concerned he is about the failure of the verification in the internet voting system. The Swiss implemented a large program of engaging technical experts to completely reassess their system and their regulations and their ways of doing the assurance associated with the internet voting system. So I think they correctly interpreted this as not only a failure of the software system, but in some ways, more importantly for Switzerland, a failure of the audit and certification process that they had running to check that the system was okay. So that's been thoroughly rejigged and that process continues. In some ways, they kind of doubled down on being more Swiss, right? More evidence, more detailed analysis, more careful examination of the facts. I don't know how this is going to go. And I don't know whether they are going to stop voting over the internet, keep voting over the internet in a much restricted form, change their regulations substantially, or exactly what they're going to do. But I'm confident in the evidence-based process that they're running. So I'm not necessarily endorsing the software in its current form or any form, but the process that they're running is very scientifically informed. Okay, so let's have a look at New South Wales. Here's what happened in New South Wales. I'm not aware of any member of the New South Wales government making any public statement that acknowledged at any point that they had ever got the memo about there having been a serious problem in the verification of their election. There were one or two members of parliament who asked the Electoral Commission some pointed questions about it. And after 5 or 10 minutes of fussing about, here's the answer that they finally got in a parliamentary committee hearing. So this is this is the Electoral Commission answering a question from members of Parliament in response to being asked about the security problems. So he says, one of the principles that we try to apply is to make it so it's verifiable from the input of the vote all the way to the count. And it's like, well, it was just demonstrated that you failed to apply that principle, right? And yet here he is just kind of declaring that that's a principle that he aims for. And it's like, well, that's great. In principle, I aim for a field medal and a front cover of Vogue, but I haven't actually done any of the achieving necessary for either of those things. But hey, we can just declare that that's what we're aiming for. And he goes on to say, he goes on to brag about the audit and certification process, including that they have a cryptographer who comes in to check all the cryptographing and ensure that all the mathematical proofs operate correctly. Now, we have just demonstrated that the mathematical proofs did not operate correctly, but that seems to be kind of an experimental error that we don't need to worry about. So in other work, my colleagues and I have also found counting errors, just nothing to do with cryptography, just bugs in their count. And they've basically responded to it in exactly the same way. So they've taken the information that we gave them about the mistakes in their count. They've declared that their software was certified to be perfectly correct. We've said, well, it's obviously not perfectly correct, is it? And they've said, oh, no, that's okay. We'll fix it. And then they've sent it back to the certification authorities who certified it perfectly correct in the first place to be recertified after the bugs we found have been fixed. We've cycled 3 times through this process for the same piece of counting code, and each time we've found a bug, it's been sent back to the same certification authority to be certified perfectly correct again. So in some ways I sold this talk as giving you the advice about how to deal with improving the quality of election administration in this country. But at this point, I sort of have to admit that I oversold it because I actually haven't got a clue how to deal with this. I just don't know how you deal with a complete imperviousness to scientific evidence. But I still think it's worth a go. So here in front of my little bug bullet point, I've written, injecting rational scientific evidence sometimes works. I hope it works in your country. And empirical testing is encouraged. Go and give it a go. Also, another thing that made a huge difference here is that Switzerland had transparency laws about the source code and the system details, whereas New South Wales has secrecy laws. It's a crime to share the source code without the authority, without permission from the Electoral Commissioner, and you can go to jail. So this makes a huge difference, I think, in the capacity of a set of electoral authorities to just kind of pretend they haven't got a problem. So get transparency laws rather than secrecy laws written in your democracy if you can. Okay, before we all get too smug, it's worth pointing out that even the very good quality academic systems aren't perfect either. So this is a joint work with Eleanor McMurtry and Olivier Pereira. We found a bug in the Civitas electronic voting system, which is based on Jules Catano and Jacobson's coercion-resistant electronic voting scheme. This is one of the most beautiful papers in this field, one of the first papers with a complete proof of security for its protocol. And it has this, it relies on this idea that you can take 2 ciphertexts and allow the authorities who share the decryption key to perform a protocol that allows them to test whether those 2 ciphertexts are equal without revealing any other information. This is called a plain text equivalence test. But there's an important little detail in the use of those tests in this paper. And if you read the proof of the coercion-resistant voting scheme, it specifically says that it requires universally verifiable plain text equivalence proofs. In other words, proofs that remain sound, even if all of the authorities collude to lie. And then it kind of references a paper and says, oh, for example, you could use this paper. But then if we go and look at the paper it references uses plain text equivalence tests. And those are specifically explained to be secure under the assumption that at least one participant honestly follows the protocol. So we have here a misalignment between the assumption that's made in the protocol and the the security property that's guaranteed from the primitive. There's nothing wrong with the primitive, there's nothing wrong with the protocol, but the primitive that's pointed to does not actually meet the assumptions in the protocol. And the Civitas implementation just uses the thing that is pointed to in the paper. But this misalignment means that universal verifiability fails because the plain text equivalence tests that they use are such that if everybody colludes together, they can make sure that things can seem to be equal when in fact they're not. And this breaks the kind of basic verifiability of the proof because the cheating set of authorities can pretend that someone has submitted a valid credential when they haven't. So even Helios has had bugs, which is exactly why Olivier knew to look for the weak Fiat-Shamir heuristic in the Swiss Post system, because they had already found and corrected the same bug in the Helios system. So I don't think any of this should surprise anyone, given that any sufficiently large software system almost certainly has these kind of bugs. But it kind of surprises me that people keep being surprised, and you still hear very brave claims about the security properties of not just protocols, but systems for internet voting. And I think another thing about this is these misalignments of primitive properties and protocol assumptions are in all three of these cases very subtle. And I think I should have written it as a nice little exercise or challenge for people who are interested in formal verification of cryptography, that if you can think of a mechanism that adequately characterizes details this fine, I think that would be a tremendous contribution. But I think it's very hard, right? It's very hard to do in general to make sure that any kind of formal analysis or model identifies these kinds of very subtle differences. Okay, what about the Estonian system? Everybody knows the Estonian system is perfectly secure, right? Well, in an astonishing coincidence, Olivier Pereira just happens to have published today a new analysis of individual verifiability in the new version of the Estonian internet voting system. And you can look up Olivier's new result at this GitHub link down on the bottom of the slide. But the key insight here is that the combination of simple verification that they have with re-voting actually breaks individual verifiability. So the Estonian system has really this very simple method of individual verifiability. You make a ciphertext, you can submit the ciphertext if you like, and you can just check directly whether that ciphertext has the, you can demand that that ciphertext be opened and demand that they show you that it produced that it encodes the vote that you wanted. So it's exactly like Helios, except that you cast the thing that you challenged. So it seems very simple, except it also has a feature that allows you to re-vote. And this is meant to be a defense against coercion. And because it's meant to be a defense against coercion, it's important that the verification process not expose whether your vote has been clobbered by a re-vote. So Olivier's attack really just takes advantage of this opportunity for a cheating device to re-vote and the feature that the user doesn't get told whether or not the thing they're verifying has been substituted by a revote or not. So the attack is simply that the cheating device gets the voter's instructions about how they want to vote, makes a ciphertext, sends it off to the system, but pretends to crash. And then the voter tries to revote again, and the cheating device sends a different vote, which will now override the true voter's first vote, but it sends the voter the verification information for the first vote. So the voter is happily verifying the ciphertext, which truly is the thing that they wanted. It's just that that ciphertext isn't the vote that gets counted. So from our list a few slides ago of all of the internet voting systems we know, we see everything we know of has or has had serious cryptographic errors, which completely undermine its basic security properties. All right, so everybody, let's talk about Helios now, because Helios is actually the best thing we have. I think it's a great system. You know, I really love it. It's very simple. Its logic is very clear. It's had such good, careful public examination. I'd be exceedingly surprised if there are further really fundamental bugs. But so Helios takes us into a different set of things that we can think about. Now I want to think about real people actually using it. So I hope some of you, 35 of you participated, or maybe not 35 of you, maybe just one person who voted 35 times. But anyway, some people participated in my highly secure online Twitter poll. And I asked you how many times you had challenged your Helios vote in an IOCR election. And for a long time, there was nobody who said exactly 2, actually. So for the first 48 hours or so of this survey, there was about 3/4 of people who said 1, and about 1/4 of people, sorry, 3/4 of people who said none. And the remaining people all said exactly 1. And I was going to say, well, then there's an obvious, perfectly successful strategy for a cheating client, isn't there? Because all you need to do if you want to get away with cheating a good 1/6 or so of the time is to tell the truth for the first ciphertext. And if the person casts a second ciphertext, to cheat on that ciphertext. And that would have worked for the effective manipulation of about 20% of votes, which would probably be enough to swing the overall election result. And then I see in the last few hours, someone has said that they actually challenged exactly 2 ciphertexts, which is pretty exciting. And that is one person, isn't it? Yes, one person out of 35. So now let's think a little bit about what that means for our cheating Helios client. There's kind of 2 ways to respond to this possibility now, right? One is you could be a very, very careful cheating Helios client, and you could be honest for the first 2 and assume that you could get away with cheating on about 3% and be completely undetected. The other attitude to take to this is to say, well, you know, I'm going to go back to the first cheating strategy. I'm going to cheat on the second ciphertext, knowing that there's only about a 10% chance that it's going to be challenged. And if I get caught, I'm just going to pretend that the voter doesn't remember how they wanted to vote, right? In other words, in this system, there's very little disincentive for the cheater to get caught, because even if they do get caught, it's really only the voter's word against theirs. So this is another really important design goal, I think, which some of the in-person systems have, but which the internet systems as a general rule don't have, which is if a component cheats and if they get caught, then is it a matter of actually having real evidence that that component misbehaved, or even that the system misbehaved? Or is it simply the voter's word against the computer's word in claiming what vote they asked for in the first place? And I think that really matters to the incentives for cheating. Okay, final thing before I move on to polling place voting. One argument that is often brought out, particularly in Australia, is that voting over the internet is good for voters with disabilities because it makes it easier for them to vote. But I think this thing about Helios that we've just seen shows that if anything, it's exactly the opposite, right? That real verification, particularly real cast as intended verification, even among the most expert and paranoid people in the world, is actually fiddly and really hard, sufficiently so that most of us don't even bother to do it at all. So this argument that internet voting is enfranchising voters with disabilities, I find particularly hard to take, because actually because actual cast as intended verification without coming into the polling place and being able to deal with a simpler kind of paper-based system is the least usable thing anywhere in security, right? This is, at best, this is a way for cryptographers to vote. It is not a way for voters with disabilities to vote at all. And I really think it's often just used as an excuse to not set up adequate provision in a polling place for people with disabilities to access. All right. Okay, so now I'm going to transition from internet voting to things that can happen in a polling place. I want to say that in no way am I dissing Helios, right? Just to be clear, I love Helios and I think Helios is fantastic. I think it's the best system we have. I use it whenever I have to run a real election over the internet when I'm not using the highly secure Twitter poll. Helios is fantastic. It's really, really good, but it exposes this fact about people that we don't bother checking things very carefully. However, it's very clear that this is not the fault of Helios, right? Not in any way. And in fact, this study shows that even if you do the simplest possible thing and just print out a plain paper ballot for people, only about 40% of the participants in the study reviewed it at all. And only 6.6% actually noticed, or at least told somebody else that they'd noticed that there was a problem. So this study indicates that even if you don't add any fancy crypto or any sophisticated challenging or anything, the capacity for people to check when a computer just doing a basic simple printout has done something wrong is very, very limited. They went on to say, and this is again is going to be an important theme, that, quote, carefully designed interventions, end quote, can improve verification performance. In other words, really making sure that the person is forced to, or strongly encouraged or gently nudged to actually check what they're supposed to be checking. Okay, so some of you might have read the 3 or 4 page abstract that I wrote in preparation for this talk that's gone into the proceedings. And I wrote a little bit about code voting and usability based on a study by Oksana Kulik and Melanie Volkama and some of their colleagues. And their study showed that when code voting was incorporated into the voting process, it was a lot more effective than the kind of challenge-based methods that Helios uses. And the idea here, so the idea of code voting is that if you're choosing just one candidate, so you're just kind of conducting a simple kind of election, 1 out of K options, each option comes with a code that you get sent on some separate piece of paper. And then when you choose that option, the system kind of gives you back the code and you're supposed to check that the code you got matches the candidate you wanted to choose. So it's been obvious to me for ages that this does not work for Australia because we have preferential voting where you're expressing a list of preferences rather than choosing an individual candidate. So I've never really thought about it very hard, and I've just kind of looked at the empirical studies that come out of Europe in particular. It was pointed out to me after I wrote that abstract that it really doesn't work in the US either because there are zillions and zillions of contests. So it's one thing to get one code for one kind of choice of party in a parliamentary election, and it's a completely different thing to get one code for each of dozens of different options on a great big long US ballot. Obviously, also the trust assumptions for code voting are a lot stronger than the challenge-based mechanisms for Helios, but I'm just talking about the usability of it at this point. So I think the bottom line is think about the requirements for your own country and realize that studies in other countries based on other kinds of voting systems and other sorts of assumptions are worth reading and interesting, but not necessarily definitive when it comes to what works best for you. Okay, receipt freeness is really, really, really hard. This is the discovery of Josh Benello back in the 90s in Stock. And so receipt freeness is a privacy property, but a very, very, very strong one. So not only should the system keep your vote secret, but also it should make it impossible for you to prove how you voted, even if you actively want to. So this seems to be achievable in a polling place, assuming that the voter doesn't control the voting device, because that allows us to hide detailed information like how the ciphertext was made from the voter. Although, of course, you'd better hope that the adversary doesn't control the voting computer either. There are also plenty of remote schemes which have kind of a passive or sort of honest but curious version of receipt freeness, where if you follow the protocol, you can't subsequently prove how you voted. But really being not able to prove how you voted, even if you completely control the device and you've got the opportunity to communicate with the coercer, deviate from the protocol, and make up any part of it you want, is really, really, really hard. Even in the polling place, there have been a whole series of bugs found in good quality schemes that seemed to have this property, but actually turn out not to. Okay, but nevertheless, I think just about everything is easier in a polling place. And here are 5 things that really stand out as being easier. So first of all, privacy or coercion. None of these things are perfect, by the way. So the voter is usually alone. Of course, if they have their smartphone or a pushy relative beside them, then it doesn't work so well, but at least it works better and more easily than it does over the internet. Receipt freeness, again, because we assume that they don't control the voting device. Accountability, because depending on the design of the system, you might be able to prove that the system malfunctioned. Of course, this is a property of the system design, but there are some systems, for example, systems based on pre-printed ballots, in which you can, if the system misbehaves in some circumstances, prove that it misbehaved without having to be trusted to recount how you instructed it. It also just opens the opportunity for really easy individual verification, because we can base it on a plain paper ballot under the assumption that somebody looks at it. And also, finally, I think this point about the carefully designed interventions is actually really powerful, and the opportunity to guide people through verification, encourage them to do it properly, help them out if they make a mistake, is actually a huge benefit of voting in a polling place. All the more so if we're using a complicated or fancy cryptographic design that people might not understand very well. I suspect that a lot of the motivation for internet voting is actually that it kind of keeps these problems out of sight, when actually it would be much better to bring them into the polling place and guide people through them. Okay, risk limiting audits. I don't know if you've heard about this. If you're in the US, you probably have. If you haven't, this is an entirely statistical concept, although I think a statistical concept for which cryptographers could have a lot of sympathy. The idea is that we assume that the paper ballots are all good. So we assume that the paper ballots have been carefully looked after, properly secured, and so forth. And we conduct a randomized statistical audit of the paper evidence to give us either to detect that there's a problem or to give us some confidence that the answer is right. And there's some very beautiful statistics and some very thorough analysis that show that you can design auditing algorithms in such a way that you can prove that the probability of mistakenly accepting and certifying a wrong election result is bounded by some risk limit that you can choose in advance. And the idea is that you go along doing this audit of the paper ballots until either your risk is satisfied, or you decide that the evidence is inconclusive and you manually count all of the paper records. So there's extensive theory for all kinds of election setups. Most of it is oriented around the US, but there's plenty of extensions for instant runoff voting, D'Hondt, European-style kind of parliamentary elections, and so on. There's open source software from a couple of different places, some from Philip Stark and some from Voting Works by Benedita. But of course, there are also obvious trust assumptions and limitations, right? You can only participate in this verification if you are physically present, because you have to look at the paper ballot being retrieved. And there's this huge assumption on the custody, the secure custody of the paper ballots. Now, it's an interesting little fact that if you actually think about how to run a risk limiting audit, there's a little bit of crypto involved, because at the very least, you need to prove that the random selections necessary for auditing for choosing the paper ballots have been done with integrity and are not predictable. So here's Ron Rivest and Philip Stark tossing dice and inputting those dice into some codes for generating the pseudo-random permutation for selecting the ballots. And so this is what turns the statistical process into a publicly verifiable process, because now everybody else can see how Ron rolled the dice and verify that they really are going and fishing out the ballots that they're supposed to, not some kind of pre-programmed set of ballots that have been carefully chosen to not cheat. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is end-to-end verifiable voting in a polling place, which I actually think is probably the most interesting thing to do. There's lots of different designs, each reflecting the requirements of a different election system. So on the left, we have the VVote project from my home state of Victoria, which uses preferential voting. You can see all the preference numbers mushed into a proto-vote ballot. On the right up the top, we have the Wombat voting system from Israel, which is just beautiful and very simple, which I think reflects probably the very simple voting system that's in use there. And down on the bottom right, we have the Scantegrity invisible ink system, which unsurprisingly looks a lot like an American ballot because of the use in that. And they use codes. It's kind of a hybrid between code voting and challenge-based voting. So there's lots of different designs. Interestingly enough, neither the VVote system nor the Scantegrity system is still in use, although they were both used in government elections. And I think the Wombat system is still being used, but not in government elections. So all of these things they're really cool, but they're not actually being run for electing governments. I could be wrong about Wombat, I should double check. So the most exciting thing that's happening, which I've been a little bit involved in, but mostly as an observer, is Josh Benelow's Election Guard thing, which is a complete open source kit for supporting end-to-end verifiable elections in concert with risk limiting audits. So I actually think this is the future of voting, in my opinion. And if my abstract gave the impression that I didn't think the cryptographic solutions were of value, that was absolutely not the impression I meant to give. I think that this approach to combine the cryptographic solutions with the paper-based statistical auditing is absolutely the way to go. And the reason I think this is the way to go is that if it's well designed, you get a sort of disjunctive set of trust assumptions. In other words, the cryptographic evidence has some assumptions. The statistical evidence has some assumptions, specifically about the chain of custody of the paper ballots. The thing that I really love about Election Guard is the way that it's designed to take advantage of both of them. So you can either trust the statistical evidence associated with the paper ballots, or you can trust the cryptographic evidence for the continuing proof that your ballot was included in the tally even after you walked away. And I think the flexibility in the combination of those two things is just the right way to go. So I think this will not give us voting over the internet, because it doesn't solve any of the earlier things we talked about for that, but this will give us very flexible and very high integrity voting in a polling place, potentially, in a polling place a bit further away from home, or in a polling place a couple more weeks before the election, or it will reduce the strain on the paper ballot custody assumption anyway. So I think this is really cool. I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to summarize my favorite technical open problems. So one of the issues with combining the cryptographic verification and the risk limiting audit ideas is that cryptographic verification, particularly individual verification, tends to be a thing that you do at the time, right? You can challenge your Helios ballot at the time that you're voting, but if you miss your chance and you realize after the election that it was actually super close, you can't escalate in the way that you could with risk limiting audits. You can go back and check that your ciphertext is on the bulletin board, but you can't necessarily check that. You can't redo the check of whether or not that ciphertext reflected your intentions. So here's an interesting little puzzle is, can you think of a form of cryptographic verification that can be escalated if the result is close? A second thing that those Athenian disks had that we don't have in our electronic systems is publicly verifiable privacy. Right? They have publicly verifiable, we have publicly verifiable integrity, but I can't actually see whether my electronic ballot is private or not. Usually I'm trusting a threshold of authorities who have the decryption key. Thirdly, cast as intended verification is the hardest part, because that's the part that an ordinary person has to do. And it's probably going to be different in your country from what it is in every other country that has invented something, because your elections are probably a little bit different from everybody else's. On that note, the carefully designed interventions to encourage people to do the verification carefully obviously have to be specific. My favourite puzzle at the moment is trying to do something like the hybrid paper and crypto schemes, but for remote voting, and trying to think about whether there's a nice way of getting the information on the plain paper ballot posted back, but also using some cryptographic techniques to give people evidence of their vote having been properly counted when it arrived. So again, I think I wrote the wrong thing in my abstract. I sort of referred to what happened to the piece of paper, but what I actually mean, of course, is what happens to the information. The last thing that's really interesting is verifying that only eligible people voted without making the voter list completely public. All right, I am out of time, so I'm going to skip my reality check and this is my concluding slide. Okay, so what can you do? First of all, you can find out what's wrong with your own electoral system and fix it before the election. If you're not having an election right now, then now is exactly the right time to find out a little bit about what's happening in your democracy and make suggestions for change before it gets too catastrophic. One thing that I found reduces the heat a lot in every country where I've seen it happen is to get an agreement on requirements carefully written down in advance, because then you can have a scientific discussion about whether a particular system meets the requirements rather than a kind of heated argument about whether the system is adequate according to what you think the requirements should be. And finally, I think on the theme of just teaching people to think in a bit more of a paranoid way, persuade them that they need to build evidence into their electoral processes rather than just building the system so that everything kind of seems to be okay, which I bet you will find is the sort of natural instinct of almost everybody who builds election systems. Encourage them to think that it's a good thing when they notice that something went wrong. And on that note, I will end and welcome discussion and questions.
Thanks, Vanessa. So if there are any questions, you could, I see nobody typed any questions in the Zulip or in chat. You can type them in, you can try to just jump in and talk, or given there are many people, you could also try to raise your hand and I'll call on you. But I guess the first one can just jump in and unmute yourself and ask questions. Oh, there's something in the chat by Niels. You wanna?
Right.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I think you're missing one of the most important requirements. The voting system should be so simple that almost everybody can understand it. Any use of crypto looks like magic to most people, and that is not good. No, I 100% agree. And indeed, in some ways, I think the massive industry of snake oil around internet voting, blockchain voting, etc., is really because of exactly this issue, right? That the difference between a thing that is actually sound, a thing that is sound is indistinguishable from a thing that is complete rubbish to almost all normal voters. And you're 100% right. I think that's part of the reason that the hybrid systems are really good, because you can choose your trust assumption. And, if the crypto is unintelligible, you can trust the paper. And if you understand the crypto, you can work with that. Or if you trust somebody who understands the crypto, then you can work with that. But yes, I agree. I don't know how to do crypto that everybody understands.
Vanessa, I have a question that's vaguely related to this point, which is in your first part of the talk, you talked about this issue of, all these implementations are wrong, even though the components are fine, but they just implemented it in the wrong context or revealed a trapdoor. that doesn't sound to me specific to voting systems. Isn't it like a difficulty in any crypto implementation?
Yeah.
And this
Yeah,
comment that you just
absolutely.
discussed makes voting even harder, possibly, but it just
Yeah,
seems.
absolutely. And I think part of it, I think you're absolutely right. In some ways, I think that there's a degree of trust in voting systems that isn't imposed on anything else, right? Everything has bugs, right? Everything has bugs, including voting systems, and yet somehow people seem willing to trust voting systems, even when they know that they actually have no independent way of checking it. So your banking system, you can kind of see if you've lost all your money, but with voting, there's no corresponding kind of basic double checking and no capacity to, often no capacity to recover, often no capacity even to naturally detect when there's been a problem. So yeah, I completely agree. In some ways, what I was saying was exactly what you just said. Absolutely. That in fact, every system has these bugs, and yet somehow we seem willing to tolerate the possibility in systems that have just the strongest threat model you could possibly have. Oh, to Niels Ferguson, who said, I'd just pen and paper. Yeah. So yes, to a large extent, I'd just pen and paper too. Actually, in Australia, we almost exclusively pen and paper. I do think you get something you get a few things out of risk limiting audits because you can count, you can just count faster, right? So in countries like the US, where they're counting vast, complicated things, they can't count manually in practice. So they have to do something other than count everything by hand, and they can do that. I think what the polling place end-to-end verifiable systems add on top of pen and paper is not having to trust the paper chain of custody. But I completely agree that it should be an on top of rather than an instead of.
There's a comment from John Kelsey in the chat. But if John or anyone else wants to ask in person, live question, that might be good.
I might have some background noise.
Hi, John.
If you can, I might have some background noise here. So, but all I was pointing out is for end-to-end systems, they are optimized for making sure that if there's any fraud, you have a good chance of detecting it. That offers another angle of attack where my goal is just to discredit an election that's very close. Sort of do the equivalent of the attack on the naive coin flipping protocol, where I abort the protocol if the coin flip's going to go the wrong way, right? So if I just tamper with some machines so that me and some other people in on the attack get bad receipts, then we decide whether or not to release that to discredit an election that we don't like. And yeah, Niels, I mean, it's hard to imagine any powerful elected figure trying to undermine the outcome of an election.
Yeah. Again, completely agree. And again, I guess it depends how you respond to that. Yeah, I agree. I agree. That's a problem. I don't have a good answer to that, except again to say that if I was organizing it, I'd make sure. Well, although I mean, to some extent, the same is true for just about anything, including plain paper, right? That you can say whatever, that you saw the officials throwing the paper ballots in the trash or something. I don't know whether the end-to-end systems actually make this worse. They definitely don't solve it. Yeah, it seems like a hard problem to me.
Vanessa, there's a question in Zulip from Carolyn. How can voting be implemented in highly untrusted environments such as non-democratic countries? Is there a way crypto can offer a better security assumption in these environments for the citizens?
Wow, that's a really hard question. I think, I mean, it relates a little bit to John's point about willful undermining of the perceived value of the election, right? I think if the people running the election are willfully trying to make it look as if it is badly run, then I don't know that there's very much you can do, unfortunately. Because exactly like John just said, the purpose of all these methods of checking is to have an opportunity to see whether it's been badly run. But if the objective is to make it look like it's been badly run, well, we don't really have a defense against that. I wish I did have a solution to that problem, but I don't think I do.
Yeah, there was
I
a
think
follow-up
if you-
comment that crypto would just add another layer of distrust in election due to lack of understanding of the math.
Possibly so.
Possibly.
Yeah, possibly an easier thing to well, possibly another thing to discredit. Yeah, sadly. It's a
Matti
risk
or
management
Daniel,
issue.
do you want to ask your question out
Yeah.
loud, or should I read it?
Yeah.
Oh, I could ask it. Yeah, no, I think this is an interesting question. I mean, is there a way that you could maybe keep a ballot public, so it's a well-formed kind of ballot, but then anonymize the connection between a voter and then a particular plain text ballot? Does that make
There are
sense?
schemes that I haven't seen one in which there isn't a big trust assumption on the authorities for only
Vanessa, I
voter
think,
names
oh,
beside their encrypted ballots, right? And
sorry, Vanessa, your
Sorry, did I
connection cut
disappear?
out.
oh, am I back? How's this?
You're back, but you should repeat your entire comment.
Oh dear, I believe you've frozen again, Vanessa.
Maybe unshare the screen and just talk.
Vanessa, we can't hear you, unfortunately. I'm so glad this doesn't happen during the talk, but
Well, in the meantime, I have a comment that just occurred to me. It's a type of attack I haven't heard anybody mention before. Suppose some of the organizers of the election would like to have the option of discrediting the election later. So you run the election, and part of the cryptographic systems, we can verify them. But if my goal is to discredit the election, if the people with the central keys or something like that do the wrong thing, it provides incontrovertible proof of manipulations in the election. That seems to be a different attack model.
That's the connection now. Hi,
I
everyone.
think you're
Sorry about
back.
that. Sorry about that. So now you have to tell me what I missed.
Yeah, Niels, you want to repeat your
Oh,
attack?
Yeah. I just, as part of the talk in the comments, I came up with a new attack on election system I never thought about. Suppose the people who organize the election want to have the option of discrediting an outcome they don't like.
Yeah.
So with cryptographic systems, they could misbehave later. If they don't like the outcome, they misbehave. They provide incontrovertible proof that the election was defrauded.
Mm-hmm.
And they can invalidate an outcome they don't like.
Mm-hmm.
That would seem to be a separate attack that I have never heard anybody look into.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And your point is that if we're all voting with paper ballots and glass urns or whatever, then it's a lot harder for them to do that.
The paper ballots, the fraud doesn't scale very well, right? I think one of the important ratios is how many people are in the conspiracy versus how many votes can you defraud or can you affect.
Yep. And how likely are you to get caught?
And the other part, obviously, the primary fraud is in photo suppression and photo roll manipulations and stuff like that. It's not in the counting. The counting is the easy part.
I don't know.
Well, we have widespread
assume
photo suppression here in America. It is a
Yes.
primary goal of one of the main parties.
Yes, that's true. You do. Yeah. Whereas we have compulsory voting in Australia. So back to the point that different democracies are different, right? I think different weak points are probably different depending on exactly what the rest of the setup is.
Yeah.
But yes, I agree with that. The vote suppression in the United States is probably the worst thing. You don't even need to bother fiddling with the numbers, fiddling with the count, given that such a large fraction of voters are so deliberately excluded. Pretty bad.
We're over time, but it's an interesting discussion. So if somebody wants to add another comment or question, we can do maybe one more before wrapping up. There've been some comments on the chat. But Vanessa, just to make sure I understood you correctly, in your last slide, you don't need to share it. You said, find out what they're doing in your country and fix it. So by fix it, your ideal fix would be like abandon the fully electronic thing and do a hybrid system. That's your fix.
Yeah, that's what I would do.
Okay. Yeah. Just wanted to make sure.
I would put out that it is not without discussion that electronics and cryptography have any role to play in elections whatsoever.
I think that's a very fair point. I agree. There are some countries in which there just doesn't need to be a role for electronic stuff. I think there are other countries in which manual counting of paper ballots is not feasible. It's not really feasible in the United States. And you could say, well, just do risk limiting audits then and don't do any cryptography. And I think that's definitely a defensible position. But then what you get from the end-to-end verifiability stuff on top of the risk limiting audits is that you don't have to trust the people who looked after the paper.
Yes. Niels, you seem to be assuming this is an either-or situation, and it's possible to have pen and paper ballots and end-to-end verifiability and risk limiting audits. You can get the best of all.
I think there are some very interesting ideas there, and I haven't quite evaluated them, but I worry greatly about this rush to, we should apply cryptography. And I greatly object to things like the ICR using a Helios system and endorsing it with that. We make claims of security for pieces of computer software. And I think that goes much too far.
Some of us are old enough to remember when the ballots in IACR were cast by the postal system. And I must say the international postal system has some unique failure modes.
Yes, this is done for reachability, not for other things.
I completely understand, but we could do that without endorsing a magic box of cryptographic formulas. Anyway, let's not go into that discussion. That's not relevant to this.
Well, I definitely wouldn't endorse that for government elections. I hope that was clear from the talk. In some ways, the whole point of this analysis was to say, I don't think that internet voting for government elections is a good idea. I think it's a really bad idea. And I think it's been shown to fail over and over and over and over again.
This was obvious.
Okay, so thank you very much, Vanessa, for a very interesting talk and discussion. We'll end the session here. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'll hang it on the chat for the next few hours. So anybody who would like to ask more questions or engage in more discussion is very welcome.
Yeah,
Thanks for
that
having
is-
me, everybody.